In the misty shadows of Marwood Hall, young heiress Eleanor Ashby is found drowned in the ornamental ponder, tragic accident, or something sinister. Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet knitting, unravels a web of secrets. A charming fiancé with debts, a loyal maid hiding fears, a bitter brother with a motive, and a tutor whose scholarly mask conceals a swindler's past. A forged will, a silver hairpin, and a heel mark by the water point to greed and betrayal. Can Miss Marple expose the killer before the truth sinks forever? Chapter 1. The Pond at Marwood Hall. The late morning mist clung to the lawns of Marwood Hall, curling round the gnarled oaks and draping the ornamental pond in a shroud of silver. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the high-backed armchair of the drawing room, gazed through the tall windows at the sombre scene. Her knitting needles moved with a steady rhythm, the soft click-clack a counterpoint to the heavy silence of the gathered company. The air was thick with grief for, Miss Marple noted with her keen, bird-like eyes, the pretense of it. Eleanor Ashby, the young heiress to the Ashby fortune, had been discovered at dawn, her body floating amid the lily pads of the pond. Her pale blue gown, sodden and clinging, had billowed like a ghostly sail, and her golden hair, tangled with weeds, framed a face serene in death. The local constable, Mr. Heiress, a ruddy-faced man with a penchant for hasty conclusions, had muttered about a tragic slip on the Algislake bank. A dreadful accident, he'd declared, mopping his brow. But Miss Marple, invited to the hall by her old friend Lady Compton, a distant cousin of the Ashbys, was not so easily convinced. Accidents, in her experience, were often the masks worn by darker truths. The drawing-room, with its faded damask curtains and gleaming mahogany, held the principal players in this quiet drama. Roland Vance, Eleanor's fiancés, stood by the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel as if posing for a portrait. His dark hair was impeccably groomed, his tailored suit unmarked by the morning's tragedy. His voice, when he spoke, carried a practiced tremor. She was so vibrant, so full of plans, he said, addressing no one in particular. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on his polished boots, pristine despite the muddy paths that wound from the hall to the pond. She recalled a certain Mr. Langley from St. Mary Mead, whose charm had concealed a ledger of debts. Men like Roland, she thought, often wore their sincerity as lightly as their silk cravats. Clara Dobbs, the maid, moved silently among the group, offering tea from a silver tray. Her thin frame seemed to quiver with suppressed emotion, and her eyes, red from weeping, darted nervously toward the corridor. Miss Eleanor was an angel, she whispered as she poured for Miss Marple, her voice barely audible. The old lady noted the faint tremor in Clara's hands and the curious stain on her apron, a greenish smudge like pondweed. Clara claimed to have been in the pantry polishing silver when the tragedy occurred. A maid's work is never noticed, Miss Marple mused, until it is questioned. Henry Ashby, Eleanor's brother, sat apart, his lanky form hunched, in a wing chair near the bookshelves. His pale face was half hidden by a cloud of cigarette smoke, and his fingers toyed with a dog-eared volume of Keats. He had said little since Miss Marple's arrival, his responses to condolences curt and distracted. Eleanor was always wandering off, he remarked to Lady Compton, his tone more irritated than mournful. Miss Marple observed the faint lines of resentment etched around his mouth. She thought of the vicar's son in St. Mary Mead, who had nursed a quiet grudge against his favoured sister. Sibling bonds, she knew, could fray under the weight of envy, The final figure, Mr. Lionel Gray, the tutor, stood near the piano, his wiry frame slightly stooped, as if burdened by unseen worries. His spectacles glinted in the weak sunlight, and his fingers, stained with ink, fidgeted with a loose thread on his cuff. Miss Ashby was a remarkable student, he said, his voice soft but with an edge Miss Marple could not quite place. Her loss is incalculable. Yet his eyes, darting toward the study door, betrayed a restlessness that belied his words. Gray had been hired only 6 months prior, his credentials vouched for by a vague letter from a northern academy. Miss Marple, who had once uncovered a fraudulent curate in her village, knew that a scholar's demeanour could conceal a sharper intent. Lady Compton, a stout woman with a fondness for gossip, leaned toward Miss Marple, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. Such a shock, Jane. Eleanor was to inherit the trust fund next month, millions, they say. And now, this. Miss Marple nodded, her expression placid, but her mind was already threading connections. A fortune, a sudden death, and a pond too picturesque to be trusted. She recalled the village pond in St. Mary Mead, where a child's drowning had revealed a family's secrets. Water, she thought, had a way of holding truths beneath its surface. As the group dispersed Roland to pace the terrace, Clara to the kitchens, Henry to his books, and Gray to the schoolroom, Miss Marple remained, her knitting a pretext for observation. The pond, visible through the window, glimmered like a mirror, its secrets locked in its depths. A slip, she murmured, her needles pausing, or a push. The thought settled in her mind, as delicate and persistent as the mist outside. Chapter R. The Fiances' charm, the afternoon sun. A pale disk struggling through the thinning mist cast long shadows across the terrace of Marwood Hall. The air was heavy with the scent of damp moss and the faint metallic taps of the ornamental pond, its surface glinting in the distance like a polished mirror. Miss Jane Marple sat at a small Rortian table, her knitting basket at her side, the soft click-clack of her needles a steady rhythm against the oppressive quiet. Her eyes, bright and sharp beneath the brim of her sensible hat, followed Roland Vance as he paced the flagstones, his tailored silhouette a study in restless elegance. The tragedy of Eleanor Ashby's death that morning hung over the estate, yet Miss Marple sensed in Roland's movements not grief, but a calculated unease. As if he were an actor uncertain of his lines, Roland paused by the low balustrade, one hand resting on the weathered stone, the other adjusting the silk tie at his throat. His dark hair, immaculately combed, caught the sunlight, and his features handsome in that effortless way that drew eyes were arranged in an expression of sombre reflection. Yet Miss Marple, whose years in St. Mary Mead had honed her perception of human nature, noted the fleeting tightness at the corners of his mouth, the way his gaze darted not toward the pond where his fiancée had met her end, but toward the hall's upper windows, as if seeking an unseen observer. She recalled a certain Mr. Hargreaves, a St. Mary Mead charmer who had wooed a spinster for her modest inheritance, his smiles as polished as his deceit. Men like Roland, she thought, wore their charm like a well-cut coat, tailored to conceal what lay beneath. Miss Marple, isn't it? Roland's voice broke her reverie, smooth and warm, as he approached her table. He offered a smile that flickered like a candle in a draught, bright but unsteady. Lady Compton mentioned you're a guest here. She speaks highly of your insight. The pause before insight was deliberate, his eyes searching hers, as if weighing whether she was a harmless old lady or something more formidable. Miss Marple returned a mild nod, her needles never faltering. Lady Compton is too kind, she said, her voice soft as the breeze that stirred the ivy. I'm merely an observer of life's little patterns. Roland settled into the chair opposite her, uninvited but with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to being welcomed. A dreadful day, he said, his tone heavy with practiced sorrow. Eleanor was everything to me. Her laughter, her spirit, she lit up this gloomy old place. He gestured vaguely toward the hall, its grey stone facade looming behind them. We were to marry in the spring, you know. She loved sketching by that wretched pond. I keep thinking, if I'd been with her. His voice trailed off, and he pressed a hand to his forehead, the gesture just theatrical enough to catch Miss Marple's attention. She noted the absence of tears, the way his fingers lingered on his brow as if to ensure she saw his distress. In St. Mary Mead, she had known a young poet who feigned heartbreak to escape a scandal. His sighs, like Roland's, had been carefully rehearsed. Such a loss, Miss Marple murmured, her tone sympathetic but her eyes keen. Tell me, Mr. Vance, where were you this morning when poor Eleanor met her fate? The question was gentle, almost incidental, but her gaze held his, steady and unyielding. Roland's smile tightened, a fleeting shadow crossing his face before he recovered. In the village, he said smoothly, I was riding needed to clear my head. The blacksmith, Mr. Tate, saw me near the forge around 8. We talked about horses, the weather. He's a decent sort, Tate. He leaned back, crossing one leg over the other, his polished boots catching the light. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on them, pristine despite the muddy paths that snaked from the hall to the pond. A man who rode through the village, she thought, might bear some trace of dust or damp, unless his morning had been spent elsewhere, carefully curated. A solid alibi, she said, her tone so mild it might have been a compliment. And yet, a man so devoted might have joined his fiancée at her favourite spot, mightn't he? Roland's fingers twitched, but his smile held. Eleanor liked her solitude when she sketched, he said. I didn't want to intrude. He rose, as if to signal the conversation's end, and added, she was always so independent. It's what I loved about her. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking, but her mind was already threading his words into the tapestry of the morning's events. Independence, she mused, was a convenient trait to ascribe to a woman now silent. Lady Compton emerged from the French doors. Her stout figure swathed in a shawl, a tray of scones and clotted cream balanced in her hands. Roland, you must eat, she insisted, her voice a blend of maternal concern and aristocratic command. And you, Jane, you'll have a scone, won't you? She set the tray on the table, her eyes darting between Miss Marple and Roland. With the eagerness of a woman who thrived on the drama of others' lives. Roland accepted a scone with a murmur of thanks, but Miss Marple noted how he crumpled it between his fingers, scattering crumbs onto the table, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. Lady Compton settled into a chair, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Jane, it's too awful, isn't it? Eleanor, gone like that, and Roland, poor man, so devoted. Though she hesitated, glancing at Roland, who had turned to gaze at the pond, his profile a study in melancholy. Though, Miss Marple prompted, her tone encouraging but neutral. Lady Compton leaned closer, her voice barely audible. Some in the village whisper he was after her money. He proposed so quickly 3 months ago, and Eleanor was besotted. His family's respectable, mind you, but their estate's been mortgaged for years. The Ashby fortune would have set him right. She straightened, fanning herself with a lace handkerchief. Not that I believe such talk, of course. Roland's a gentleman. Miss Marple's needles paused, just for a moment. Whispers are like cobwebs, she said. Easily spun, but they cling. Her mind, however, seized the detail with the precision of a seamstress pinning fabric. A man in debt, a sudden engagement, a fiancé now deaded, was a pattern she had seen before in the guise of a St. Mary mead merchant who'd courted a widow for her savings, only to vanish when her will favoured her nephew. Roland's ease in the hall, his familiarity with its luxuries, the crystal decanters, the Persian rugs suggested a man who craved wealth, or perhaps had already begun to count it his own. Roland turned back to them, as if sensing the shift. In conversation, I should write some letters, he said, his tone apologetic. Family, friends, they'll need to know about Eleanor. He bowed slightly, a gesture that struck Miss Marple as more courtly than heartfelt, and strode toward the house, his steps brisk but not hurried. She watched him go, noting the way he glanced at the study window as he passed, a flicker of something anticipation, perhaps, crossing his face. Her eyes narrowed. A man in mourning, she thought, did not look to a room of papers with such interest. Lady Compton sighed, breaking the silence. He's taking it hard, poor soul. But Jane, you're so clever. What do you make of it all? Constable Heiress says it's an accident, but I can't help feeling there's more to it. Her eyes gleamed with the thrill of suspicion, but Miss Marple only smiled, her expression as placid as the pond beyond. It's early days, she said. The truth has a way of rising, like cream. Lady Compton chuckled, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere, sifting the morning's impressions. Roland's alibi, his clean boots, his too perfect grief, they were threads, but not yet a pattern. Rising from her chair, she excused herself, citing a need to stretch her legs. Her steps took her toward the pond, the gravel path crunching softly beneath her sturdy shoes. The water lay still, its surface unbroken save for the occasional ripple of a fish or the drift of a fallen leaf. Eleanor's sketching spot, a stone bench beneath a willow, was empty, its surface damp but unmarked by the tools of an artist. No pencils, no sketchbook, no smudged charcoal. Miss Marple's lips pursed. A woman sketching, even in haste, would leave some trace, a dropped page, a broken lead, unless, she thought, the scene had been staged. The pond, not a place of solitude, but of deception. She stood for a moment, her shawl drawn against the chill, her eyes tracing the pond's edge. The bank was steep, slick with algae, but the grass nearby showed no signs of a struggle, no torn sod, no trampled reeds. Yet something caught her eye, a faint indentation in the mud, the shape of a heel, too narrow for a labourer's boot. She filed the observation away, her mind returning to Roland. His village ride, his blacksmith's testimony, his pristine appearance, they painted a picture of a man detached from the tragedy, or perhaps too carefully removed from it. As she turned back toward the hall, the sun dipped behind a cloud, casting the pond in shadow. Miss Marple's thoughts were as clear as the water had been moments before. Roland Vance was a man of surfaces, charming, plausible, poised, but surfaces, she knew, could hide depths as treacherous as any pond. In St. Mary Mead she had seen such men unravel, their secrets exposed by the smallest slip, a word, a glance, a footprint. Roland's story held for now, but Miss Marple's needles would keep clicking. Stitching together the truth thread by thread, she reached the terrace. Settling back into her chair, her knitting resumed as if she had never left. The hall loomed behind her, its windows like eyes watching the unfolding drama. Roland was but one piece of the puzzle, and the pond, silent and serene, held the rest. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet determination. Secrets, like stones, sank deep, but time and a sharp mind could bring them to the surface. Chapter 3. The maid's devotion. The late afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of Marwood Hall, casting a golden glow across the polished oak floors of the drawing-room. Miss Jane Marple sat near the fireplace, her knitting needles moving with their usual quiet precision, the soft click-clack blending with the faint crackle of the logs. The air held a chill despite the fire, and the lingering scent of lavender polish mingled with the heavier note of grief or its facsimile permeated the household. Eleanor Ashby's drowning in the ornamental pond that morning had left the hall subdued. Yet Miss Marple's keen eyes detected currents of unease beneath the surface, like ripples betraying a stone's fall. Clara Dobbs, Eleanor's maid, was the focus of her attention now. A wiry woman of perhaps 30, Clara moved through the room with the efficiency of long habit, her dark dress rustling as she cleared the tea tray left from Lady Compton's earlier gathering. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed from weeping, and her hands, though steady as they stacked porcelain cups, bore a faint tremble when they thought themselves unobserved. Miss Marple, whose years in St. Mary Mead had taught her to read the language of small gestures, noted the way gaze flicked toward the corridor leading to the study, a room where Eleanor's private papers were kept. It was a fleeting glance, but to Miss Marple it was as telling as a shouted confession. "Clara, dear," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle as she paused her knitting. "You must be exhausted with all this sadness. Won't you sit a moment?" The invitation was soft, almost maternal, but Clara froze, a saucer poised in her hand, as if caught in a spotlight. "Oh, ma'am, I couldn't," she said, her voice low and hurried. "There's work to be done, and Miss Eleanor," she stopped, biting her lip, and Miss Marple noted the quick flush that rose to her cheeks. "Miss Eleanor would want the house kept proper," Clara finished, her eyes dropping to the tray. "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing but her mind alert. She was fortunate to have so devoted a maid. "You were fond of her, weren't you?" Clara nodded, her fingers tightening on the saucer. "Like a sister, ma'am," she whispered. "She was kind, never a harsh word, not like some ladies." The words were fervent, yet Miss Marple caught a note of something else, fear, perhaps, or guilt lurking beneath the devotion. She recalled a St. Mary Mead housemaid, fervent in her loyalty to a cruel employer, whose tears had masked a theft. Devotion, Miss Marple knew, could be a cloak for other motives. As Clara resumed her task, Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the maid's apron, tied neatly but bearing a curious stainer, greenish smudge, like pondweed or algae, along the hem. It was faint, easily dismissed as a mark from cleaning, but to Miss Marple it was a thread in the tapestry of the day's events. She thought of the pond, its slick banks, and the absence of struggle marks near Eleanor's body. A maid, she mused, might venture near the water for innocent reasons, or for reasons less pure. "Tell me, Clara," Miss Marple said, her voice as casual as if she were discussing the weather. "Where were you this morning when Miss Eleanor was found? It must have been a terrible shock." Clara's hands stilled, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she might drop the tray. "In the pantry, ma'am," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper, polishing the silver. "I didn't hear nothing till the gardener came running." Her eyes darted to the window, where the pond glimmered in the fading light, and Miss Marple noted the way her shoulders tensed, as if bracing for a blow. "The pantry," Miss Marple repeated, nodding. Such solitary work. No one saw you. I suppose. Clara shook her head, her fingers twisting the edge of her apron. No, ma'am, just me and the silver. The answer was quick, almost rehearsed, and Miss Marple's needles paused just for a heartbeat. A solitary alibi, she thought, was as fragile as gossamer, as easily torn. She recalled a St. Mary Mead cook who'd claimed to be kneading dough while her lover slipped through the back gate. Clara's devotion to Eleanor was clear, but devotion could bind a person to secrets as tightly as to duty. The door opened, admitting Lady Compton, her stout frame swathed in a velvet shawl, her face alight with the eager curiosity of one who thrived on household dramas. Jane, you're still here. And Clara, poor thing, you look done in. She settled onto the sofa, patting the cushion beside her. Come, tell us how you're bearing up. Eleanor was so fond of you. Clara hesitated, glancing at Miss Marple, then perched on the edge of the sofa, her hands folded tightly in her lap. I'm managing, my lady, she said. It's just hard, knowing she's gone. Lady Compton leaned forward, her voice dropping. Jane, you should have seen Clara with Eleanor, always fussing over her shawls, her tige just like a mother hen. Why, Eleanor said, Clara was the only one she trusted with her little secrets. Clara's flush deepened, and Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Secrets, she thought, were the currency of a great house, and a maid was often their keeper. What sort of secrets? She asked, her tone light, as if merely indulging Lady Compton's gossip. Oh, nothing scandalous, Lady Compton said, waving a hand. Eleanor's sketches, her letters, she liked to keep them private. Clara was always ferrying them to the study, weren't you, Clara? The maid nodded, her eyes fixed on her hands. Yes, my lady. Miss Eleanor liked things tidy, but Miss Marple noted the way Clara's fingers clenched, the faint quiver in her voice. A maid who handled letters, she thought, might see more than her mistress intended, might even act on what she saw. As Lady Compton prattled on about Eleanor's habits, Miss Marple's mind turned to the study, a room she had yet to visit, but which seemed to draw the attention of more than one resident. Clara's glances, Roland's fleeting look earlier. That day they suggested a focal point, a place where threads might converge. She made a mental note to examine it, perhaps with Lady Compton's unwitting assistance. For now, she returned her attention to Clara, who had risen to resume her duties, the tray balanced carefully in her hands. Clara, Miss Marple said. As the maid reached the door, did you ever see Miss Eleanor by the pond in the mornings? It seems such a lonely place to sketch. Clara paused, her back to the room, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she would not answer. Then, in a voice barely audible, she said, Sometimes, ma'am. She liked the quiet, but not today, not that I saw. The words hung in the air, and Miss Marple noted the slight hesitation, the way Clara's shoulders stiffened before she slipped through the door. Lady Compton sighed, fanning herself with her handkerchief. Poor Clara, she's taking it hard, isn't she? But Jane, what do you think? Constable Heiress is so sure it was an accident, but I can't shake the feeling there's more to it. Her eyes gleamed with the thrill of suspicion, but Miss Marple only smiled, her expression as serene as the pond outside. Feelings are like shadows, she said. They hint at shapes, but need light to reveal them. Lady Compton chuckled, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere, piecing together the fragments of Clara's behaviour. Rising from her chair, she excused herself, citing a wish to take the air before dinner. Her steps led her not to the terrace, but to the servants' corridor, where she lingered near the pantry door. It was a small, windowless room, its shelves lined with gleaming silver candlesticks, trays, teapots all polished to a mirror's shine. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the space, noting the absence of any green stain, any trace of pondweed. A maid polishing silver, she thought, would not venture near the pond unless called or drawn by something else. She moved to the window at the corridor's end, which overlooked the path to the pond. The view was clear, the water visible in the distance, its surface now catching the last rays of the sun. Miss Marple stood for a moment, her shawl drawn against the evening chill, her mind sifting the day's impressions. Clara's devotion, her stained apron, her solitary alibi. Her glances toward the study, they were pieces of a puzzle, but the picture remained elusive. She thought of the pond, its deceptive calm, and the heel mark she had seen in the mud. Clara's shoes, she recalled, were narrow, like those of most maids, but the mark had been fresh, untouched by the morning's dew. As she returned to the drawing room, the hall settling into the quiet of evening, Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, a quiet counterpoint to her thoughts. Clara Dobbs was a loyal servant, but loyalty, she knew, could bind a person to a mistress or to a secret. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen such women, their tears masking truths they dared not speak. Clara's story held for now, but Miss Marple's sharp mind was already probing its seams, seeking the thread that would unravel the truth of Eleanor's death. Chapter 4. The brothers' distance. The evening shadows lengthened across Marwood Hall, their edges softening the austere lines of the library where Miss Jane Marple found herself after dinner. The room, with its towering bookshelves and the faint must of old leather, was a sanctuary of sorts, though its occupant seemed to draw no comfort from it. Henry Ashby, Eleanor's brother, sat hunched in a leather armchair by the window, a cigarette burning neglected between his fingers, its ash scattering like grey snow onto the rug. Miss Marple, invited by Lady Compton to peruse the hall's collection of novels, stood near a shelf, her knitting tucked into her basket, her eyes resting lightly on Henry. The air was thick with the scent of tobacco and the unspoken weight of the day's tragedy. Eleanor's drowning in the ornamental pond, a loss that seemed to touch Henry less with grief than with a curious detachment. Henry was a pale, lanky man, his features sharp and scholarly, his eyes shadowed by sleeplessness or something deeper. His tweed jacket, slightly frayed at the cuffs, hung loosely on his frame, and his tie was askew, as if he cared little for appearances. Miss Marple, who St. Mary Mead had taught her to read the silent language of posture and glance, noted the way Henry's fingers toyed with the spine of a book Keats. She saw its pages welcomed. He had spoken little since her arrival, his responses to condolences curt, almost dismissive, as if Eleanor's death were an inconvenience rather than a devastation. She recalled a St. Mary Mead schoolmaster, estranged from his sister, whose coldness had masked a festering envy. Sibling bonds, she thought, could be as brittle as old parchment, especially when wealth was involved. Mr. Ashby, Miss Marple said, her voice soft as she selected a volume from the shelf of Bronte, its cover worn and settled into a chair. Across from him, "This is a fine library. Do you spend much time here?" Henry glanced up, his eyes narrowing briefly, as if her presence were an intrusion. "Most of my time," he said, his tone clipped. "Books don't pester you with questions." He exhaled a plume of smoke, his gaze drifting to the window, where the pond lay hidden in the gathering dusk. Miss Marple smiled, unperturbed. "A comfort, I'm sure, in such a sorrowful time. Your sister's loss must weigh heavily. Henry's lips twitched, not quite a sneer, but close. Eleanor was reckless, he said, stubbing out his cigarette with unnecessary force. Always wandering off alone, sketching by that damned pond. I told her it was slippery, but she never listened. The words were harsh, devoid of the warmth one might expect from a brother, and Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her expression remained placid. She thought of the pond's steep bank, slick with algae, and the absence of struggle marks. Recklessness, she mused, was a convenient explanation, especially for a man who stood to gain from his sister's death. Lady Compton had mentioned the Ashby estate's division, half to Henry, but only if Eleanor died without a will. A motive, perhaps, lurking beneath his indifference. Were you close, you and Eleanor? Miss Marple asked, her tone as gentle as if she were inquiring about the weather. Henry snorted, leaning back in his chair, his fingers drumming on the armrest. Close, hardly. She was the golden child father's favourite, mother's darling, always prancing about with her sketches and her suitors. His voice carried a bitter edge, and Miss Marple noted the way his eyes flickered, not with grief, but with something akin to resentment. She recalled a St. Mary Mead boy, overlooked, in favour of his sister, whose quiet rancour had simmered until it spilled into petty theft. Resentment, she thought, was a slow poison, and Henry's seemed to have steeped for years. "Where were you this morning, Mr. Ashby, when the tragedy occurred?" she asked, her voice still mild, her fingers smoothing the pages of her book. Henry's drumming paused, and he met her gaze, his expression guarded. "Here," he said, "reading. The butler, Jenkins, saw me around 7. I didn't leave till the commotion started." His tone was flat, almost defiant, and Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing the detail away. The library's window, she had noted earlier, overlooked the pond, its view clear despite the morning mist. A man could sit here, reading or watching, or, perhaps, slipping out unnoticed, the butler's glance too brief to mark an absence. Such a solitary place. A library, she said, her tone thoughtful. One can lose oneself in a book and forget the world. Henry's eyes narrowed, as if sensing a trap, but he only shrugged. "Suits me," he said, lighting another cigarette. The match flared briefly, illuminating the lines of his face, and Miss Marple saw a flicker of unease, quickly masked. She thought of the heel mark by the pond, narrow and fresh, and wondered if Henry's shoes, scuffed but slender, might match it. The library, she mused, was a perfect alibi, its solitude as unverifiable as Clara's pantry or Roland's village ride. Lady Compton's voice broke the silence, her footsteps heavy on the oak floor as she entered, a shawl draped over her shoulders. "Jane, there you are." And Henry, brooding as ever. "You mustn't shut yourself away, you know." She settled onto a sofa, her eyes bright with the gossip she could scarcely contain. "Jane, this library was Eleanor's father's pride. Henry's taken it over, haven't you, dear? Always buried in his books." Henry's lips twitched, but he said nothing, his gaze returning to the window. Lady Compton leaned toward Miss Marple, her voice dropping. "He and Eleanor were never close, you know. She got all the attention, her looks, her charm. Henry was, well, overlooked. Not that he's bitter, of course." Miss Marple's smile was faint, her eyes on Henry, who seemed to ignore the conversation, though his fingers tightened on his book. "Families are complex," she said. "Old wounds linger, don't they?" Lady Compton nodded eagerly, oblivious to the tension in Henry's posture. Oh yes, and with the estate at stake millions, Jane and No will found yet well. It's bound to stir things up. Henry's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto Lady Compton's, and Miss Marple noted the sudden intensity, the way his jaw clenched. No will, he said, his voice low. That's news to me. Lady Compton faltered, sensing her misstep. Well, nothing's certain, she said quickly. The solicitor, Mr. Pritchard, is looking into it. Henry's gaze shifted to Miss Marple, as if assessing her role in this exchange. Then back to the window, his expression unreadable. Miss Marple's mind raced. A will or its absence was a pivot on which motives turned. Henry's inheritance, contingent on Eleanor's intestacy, gave his detachment a sharper edge. She thought of a St. Mary Mead farmer whose sisters. Death had doubled his land, his grief as thin as paper. Rising from her chair, Miss Marple excused herself, citing a need to rest before the evening's gathering. Her steps took her not to her room, but to the library's window, where she paused, her shawl drawn against the chill. The pond was a dark mirror now, its surface reflecting the first stars. The path from the library to the water was short, hidden by a copse of yews, and Miss Marple's eyes traced it, noting its seclusion. A man could slip out, she thought, and return with no one the wiser. His book left open as proof of presence. She moved to the door, her gaze falling on Henry's ashtray, piled high with stubs, some fresh, others cold. A man reading all morning, she mused, might smoke less frantically. Perhaps his nerves betrayed him. She filed the thought away, her mind returning to the pond, the heel mark, the library's view. Henry's coldness, his solitary alibi, his resentment, they were threads, but the pattern was incomplete. She thought of Clara's stained apron, Roland's clean boots, and now Henry's window, each a piece of a puzzle that centered on the still, deceptive water as she left the library. The hall settling into the hush of night, Miss Marple's steps were slow but purposeful. Henry Ashby was a man apart, his distance a shield door, a mask. In St. Mary Mead she had known such men, their silence hiding truths too heavy to speak. Henry's story held for now, but Miss Marple's sharp mind was already probing its edges, seeking the seam that would unravel the mystery of Eleanor's death. Chapter 5. The Tutor's Secrets. The morning after Eleanor Ashby's tragic drowning dawned grey and heavy, the mist clinging to Marwood Hall like a mourner's veil. Miss Jane Marple sat in the morning room, a small sunlit space overlooking the gardens, her knitting needles moving with their familiar, soothing rhythm. The room was quiet, save for the occasional chirp of a sparrow beyond the window and the faint rustle of her wool. A cup of tea, now cooling, rested on the table beside her. But her attention was fixed on the man who had just entered, Mr. Lionel Grey, Eleanor's tutor. His wiry frame, clad in a slightly ill-fitting suit, seemed to carry an invisible weight, and his ink-stained fingers fidgeted with the rim of his spectacles as he offered a nervous smile. Miss Marple, whose St. Mary Mead had taught her to discern the subtle cracks in a polished facade, noted the unease in his movements. Like a man treading a stage he had not rehearsed, Grey had been a fixture at the hall for only 6 months, hired to instruct Eleanor in history and literature task. Miss Marple suspected that required more than scholarly credentials. His presence in the morning room was ostensibly to retrieve a book he claimed Eleanor had borrowed, but his eyes, darting toward the corridor that led to the study, suggested another purpose. Miss Marple, ever the observer of human nature, recalled. a St. Mary Mead curate whose erudite sermons had masked a penchant for forging references. Men like Gray, she thought, often built their lives on the fragile scaffolding of half-truths. "Good morning, Mr. Gray," she said, her voice as gentle as the morning light, her needles pausing just long enough to invite a response. "A sad day for the hall, isn't it?" Gray started slightly, as if unaware of her presence until she spoke, and adjusted his spectacles with a quick, jerky motion. "Oh, Miss Marple, yes, terribly sad," he said, his voice soft but with a clipped edge, like a man choosing his words with care. "Miss Ashby was a brilliant pupil, so eager to learn. Her loss is incalculable." He clasped his hands, the gesture meant to convey grief, but Miss Marple noted the way his fingers twisted, betraying a restlessness that belied his words. She nodded, her expression one of quiet sympathy. "She must have valued your guidance," she said. "What was it you taught her, exactly?" "History, I believe Lady Compton mentioned." Gray's smile flickered, and he shifted his weight, his gaze drifting to the bookcase as if seeking refuge. "History, yes, and literature, Shakespeare, the Romantics." She had a keen mind, always asking questions. His voice warmed, but Miss Marple caught the slight hesitation, the way his eyes avoided hers. A tutor, she mused, knew a pupil's mind and, perhaps, her secrets. Eleanor's trust fund, soon to be hers, would have been a topic of discussion in the household, and a man like Gray, with his nervous air, might see opportunity in such knowledge. "Were you with her yesterday morning, Mr. Gray?" Miss Marple asked, her tone as casual as if she were inquiring about the weather. "Before the tragedy, I mean." Gray's fingers froze on his spectacles, and for a moment his face was a mask of calculation, quickly replaced by a look of regret. "No, alas," he said. "I was in the schoolroom, preparing lessons. I often worked alone in the mornings. Eleanor liked to sketch by the pond, you see." His voice was steady now, but Miss Marple noted the slight sheen of perspiration on his brow, despite the coolness of the room. A solitary alibi, she thought, was as flimsy as Clara's pantry or Henry's library, and Gray's seemed crafted with the same careful ambiguity. The schoolroom, Miss Marple had learned from Lady Compton, was a small attic space, its windows facing away from the ponder detail that made Gray's alibi both convenient and untestable. She recalled a St. Mary Mead bookseller, newly arrived, whose vague past had unraveled when pressed for specifics. "The schoolroom must be quiet," she said, her tone thoughtful. "A good place to focus, with no one to disturb you." Gray nodded a touch too eagerly. "Quite so," he said. "I lose track of time up there, buried in my notes." But his laugh, meant to lighten the moment, was thin, and Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her smile remained placid. Lady Compton bustled in, her presence as disruptive as a gust of wind, her arms laden with a tray of biscuits and a fresh pot of tea. "Jane, you're up early, and Mr. Gray, goodness, you look peaky. Sit, both of you, and have a biscuit." She set the tray on the table, her eyes gleaming with the eagerness of one who thrived on the hall's dramas. Gray hesitated, then perched on the edge of a chair, his hands folded tightly in his lap. Miss Marple accepted a biscuit with a murmur of thanks, her mind still on Gray's uneasy demeanour. Lady Compton, oblivious to the tension, launched into a monologue about Eleanor's studies. She adored Mr. Gray's lessons. "Jane, always quoting poetry, weren't you, Mr. Gray? Though I dare say she spent more time sketching than reading." Gray's smile was strained, but he nodded. She had an artistic soul, he said. Her sketches were quite remarkable. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, the soft click-clack, a counterpoint to her thoughts. The sketches, she recalled, had been absent from the pond's edger curious detail, given Eleanor's habit. She thought of Gray's claim to the schoolroom, his ink-stained fingers, his glances toward the study. A tutor, she mused, had access to a pupil's papers, perhaps even her private ones. The study, where Eleanor kept her letters and, possibly, her will, seemed to draw the attention of more than one resident, Clara, Roland, and now Gray. "Mr. Gray," Miss Marple said, as Lady Compton paused to pour tea, "did Eleanor ever share her sketches with you? Or perhaps her writings? A pupil often confides in a teacher." Gray's teacup rattled slightly as he set it down, and he cleared his throat. "Occasionally," he said. "She showed me a few drawings, landscapes, mostly. Nothing personal." But his eyes flicked to the corridor again, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers tightened on the chair's arm. She thought of a St. Mary Mead governess, trusted with her charge's diary, who had used its secrets for blackmail. Trust, she knew, was a door that swung both ways. Lady Compton, sensing a lull, leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Jane, you'll never guess what I heard from the housekeeper. Mr. Gray's references, well, they're not quite what they seem. A bit vague," she said, "from some obscure school up north. Not that I believe the gossip, mind you." Gray's face paled, and he rose abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair. "I should see to those lessons," he said, his voice tight. "Excuse me." He hurried from the room, his footsteps echoing in the corridor, and Miss Marple's eyes followed him, her mind racing. "Dear me," Lady Compton said, fanning herself with a napkin. "I didn't mean to upset him, but Jane, what do you make of it? All this talk of accidents, Constable Heiress is so certain, but I can't help wondering." Her eyes gleamed with suspicion, but Miss Marple only smiled, her expression as serene as the morning light. "Wondering is a start," she said. "The truth often hides in the details." Lady Compton chuckled, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere, piecing together Gray's behavior. Rising from her chair, she excused herself, citing a need to take the morning air. Her steps led her to the staircase, where she paused, glancing up toward the attic schoolroom. It was a climb she would make later, perhaps, but for now, she turned toward the study door, which stood slightly ajar. Slipping inside, she found a neat room, its desk piled with papers, letters, bills, and a few of Eleanor's sketches, though none recent. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the desk, noting a faint smudge of ink on a blotter, the kind left by a nervous hand. Gray's fingers, she thought, were never free of ink, and his interest in this room was undeniable. She left the study, her shawl drawn against the morning chill, and stepped into the garden, where the pond lay like a silver coin in the mist. Standing by its edge, she recalled Gray's alibi, his nervous laugh, his vague past. The heel mark in the mud, narrow and fresh, returned to her mind, and she wondered if Gray's shoes worn but scholarly might match it. The pond, she mused, was a stage, and Gray, with his scholar's air, was an actor whose script she had yet to read. As she returned to the hall, the mist beginning to lift, Miss Marple's needles resumed their quiet work, a steady rhythm too. Her thoughts? Lionel Gray was a man of secrets, his erudition a mask for something sharper. In St. Mary Mead she had known such men, their pasts unraveling under scrutiny. Gray's story held for now, But Miss Marple's sharp mind was already probing, it seems, seeking the truth that lay beneath the surface of Eleanor's death. Chapter 6. The will in question. The second day at Marwood Hall broke with a sky heavy and grey, the clouds pressing low over the estate as if mirroring the weight of suspicion that had settled within its walls. Miss Jane Marple sat in the library, a quieter corner than the morning room, her knitting basket at her side and a volume of Austen open on her lap, though her eyes were not on the page. The soft click-clack of her needles blended with the distant ticking of a grandfather clock, a rhythm that grounded her thoughts as she sifted through the fragments of Eleanor Ashby's death. The ornamental pond, with its deceptive calm, remained the centerpiece of the mystery. But Miss Marple's mind now turned to a new focal point. The study, a room that seemed to draw the glances of Clara, Roland, and grey like moths to a flame. The morning had brought a summons from Mr. Pritchard, the Ashby family solicitor, a wiry man with a pinched face and a manner as precise as his starched collar. He had arrived from the village, his briefcase clutched tightly, to discuss Eleanor's affairs, a task made urgent by her sudden death. Miss Marple, invited by Lady Compton to join the discussion as a discreet observer, had accepted with her usual modesty, though her sharp eyes missed nothing. The library, with its scent of old leather and wax polish, was chosen for the meeting, its seclusion fitting for matters of such delicacy. As Pritchard arranged his papers on the table, Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in his hands, a sign, perhaps, of the burden he carried. "Miss Marple," Pritchard said, adjusting his spectacles, "Lady Compton assures me of your discretion, and I confess this is a perplexing matter." His voice was low, as if the walls themselves might eavesdrop. "Eleanor Ashby's estate is considerable millions in trust, to be hers next month. But her death," he paused, glancing at the door, then continued, "it complicates things. Particularly regarding her will." Miss Marple's needles paused, just for a heartbeat, her mind alert. A will, she knew from her St. Mary Mead days, was often the fulcrum on which motives turned. She recalled a village widow whose altered will had sparked a feud. The ink barely dry before accusations flew. Pritchard opened his briefcase and produced a document, its parchment crisp despite the faint creases at its edges. "This," he said, "is Eleanor's will, signed a month ago. It's unusual." He slid it across the table, and Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes scanning the text with the precision of a seamstress inspecting stitches. The will left the bulk of Eleanor's trust fund to Lionel Grey, her tutor, with smaller bequests to Roland Vance and Clara Dobbs. Henry Ashby, notably, was absent. Miss Marple's lips pursed, a subtle sign of her surprise. "Most unusual," she murmured, echoing Pritchard's sentiment. Eleanor was young, with a fiancé and a brother, to favour her tutor so generously. Pritchard nodded, his expression grim. "Exactly. I questioned it myself, but Eleanor was adamant. She signed it in my presence, though I confess she seemed distracted that day." He hesitated, then added, "There's something else. The signature, it's hers, but the loops are too precise, not like her usual flourish." Miss Marple's eyes returned to the document, noting the signature's careful curves, its almost mechanical perfection. She thought of a St. Mary Mead forger, a clerk who had mimicked a merchant's hand to siphon funds. "A signature," she said softly, "can be a lie in ink." Lady Compton, who had been hovering near the door, bustled in, her face alight with curiosity. "Jane, Mr. Pritchard, what's this about a will?" "Oh, it's too dreadful. All this talk of money when poor Eleanor was barely cold. Her voice was a mix of indignation and eagerness, and Miss Marple smiled faintly, accustomed to her friends' flair for drama. "Money, Lady Compton," she said, "often speaks when grief is silent." Pritchard cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the interruption, and explained the will's contents, his words measured but tinged with unease. Miss Marple's mind raced as she listened. Grey, with his nervous laugh and ink fingers, stood to gain millions a motive as clear as the pond's surface. Yet the will's timing, so recent, and its exclusion of Henry, who would inherit half the estate without a will, raised questions. Roland's modest bequest suggested he was not the primary beneficiary, but his charm and debts, hinted at by village gossip, kept him in her sights. Clara's small sum seemed a gesture of affection, yet her stained apron and nervous glances suggested she knew more than she told. Miss Marple thought of the study where this will had likely been drafted, and the smudge of ink she had seen on the blotter, a trace, perhaps, of Grey's hand. "Mr. Pritchard," Miss Marple said, her tone as mild as if she were discussing a recipe. "Did Mr. Grey visit Eleanor in the study often? For lessons, perhaps?" Pritchard frowned, considering. "Frequently," he said. "She insisted on privacy for their discussions, said it helped her focus. I thought it odd, but Eleanor was strong-willed." Miss Marple nodded, her mind threading the detail into the pattern. A tutor with access to a pupil's papers, she mused, could wield influence or deceit. She recalled a St. Mary Mead governess who had coerced a child into signing a false letter, her authority unquestioned until the truth surfaced. Lady Compton, unable to contain herself, leaned forward. "Jane, do you think the will's a fake?" "Oh, it's like something out of a novel. Poor Eleanor, taken in by that Grey fellow, he's so shifty, don't you think?" Her eyes gleamed, but Miss Marple's expression remained serene. "Shiftiness," she said, "is often a matter of perspective. But a will so recent, so unexpected, it bears looking into." Pritchard, visibly relieved to have an ally, gathered his papers. "I'll examine the signature further," he said. "There are tests, ink, pressure that can confirm its authenticity. But for now, this must remain confidential." As Pritchard left to confer with the butler, Miss Marple rose, her knitting basket in hand, and excused herself, citing a need to reflect. Her steps took her to the study, where the door stood closed but unlocked. Slipping inside, she found the room unchanged, its desk still piled with letters and sketches, the ink smudge on the blotter a silent witness. She examined the papers, noting a few notes in Eleanor's hand poetry, mostly with no hint of a will, but one letter, half hidden beneath a book, caught her eye. It was addressed to Pritchard, its seal broken, and its contents brief. Eleanor expressing concern about changes to her affairs, urging a meeting. The date was 3 days before her death. Miss Marple's lips pursed. A woman worried about her affairs, she thought, might suspect deceit or danger. She left the study, her shawl drawn against the chill of the corridor, and paused by a window overlooking the pond. The water was still, its surface reflecting the leaden sky, but Miss Marple's mind was far from calm. The will, with its precise signature and staggering bequest to Grey, was a pivot in the mystery. Grey's access to the study, his vague past, his solitary alibi, they painted a picture of a man with both opportunity and motive. Yet Roland's debts, Henry's resentment, and Clara's nervousness remained threads in the tapestry, each demanding scrutiny. The heel mark by the pond narrow and fresh, returned to her thoughts, and she wondered whose shoe Gray's perhaps might fit it. As she returned to the library, the hall settling into the muted rhythm of a house in mourning. Miss Marple's needles resumed their quiet work, a steady counterpoint to her racing thoughts. The will was a forgery, she felt certain, its ink a lie that pointed to Gray. But certainty, she knew from St. Mary Mead, was a trap without proof. The pond, the study, the will, they were pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Marple's sharp mind was already tracing their edges, seeking the truth that lay beneath Eleanor's death. Chapter 7. Shadows by the Water. The third morning at Marwood Hall dawned with a restless energy, the mist having lifted to reveal a sky streaked with clouds that promised rain. Miss Jane Marple, ever an early riser, stood by the French doors of the morning room, her knitting basket left behind for once, her eyes fixed on the ornamental pond that shimmered in the distance. The water, so central to Eleanor Ashby's tragic end, held a quiet menace, its surface betraying no hint of the secrets it concealed. Miss Marple, whose St. Mary Mead had taught her that truth often lurked in the overlooked, felt the pond's pull as if it were a witness waiting to speak. Her mind, sharp and methodical, sifted through the threads of the past to daze the forged will. Gray's nervous glances, Roland's polished charm, Clara's stained apron, Henry's cold resentment, a piece of a puzzle that refused to cohere. She stepped into the garden, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path, her shawl drawn against the morning chill. The pond lay at the estate's heart, encircled by willows whose branches trailed like mourners' veils. Eleanor's sketching spot, a stone bench beneath one such tree, was her destination, and as she approached, Miss Marple's eyes scanned the ground with the precision of a botanist. The bank was steep, its algae-slick stones treacherous, but the grass nearby showed no signs of a struggle, no torn sod, no scattered leaves. She recalled Constable Heiress's verdict of an accidental slip, but the absence of disturbance troubled her. A drowning, even in panic, left marks, she thought, unless the act was swift and deliberate. The bench itself was damp, its surface unmarked by the tools of an artist. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Eleanor's sketchbook, found nearby by the gardener, had been pristine, its pages dry despite the morning dew. She thought of a St. Mary Mead girl, drowned in a stream, whose diary, clutched in death, was sodden through. A woman sketching, she mused, would cling to her work, or at least leave some tracer, smudged pencil, a torn page. The sketchbook's condition suggested it had been placed, not dropped, a detail that pointed to staging, but by whom? She knelt, her movements slow but steady, and examined the mud near the pond's edge. The heel mark she had noted before was still there, narrow and deep, its edges softened by time but distinct. It was not Clara's. She felt certain her shoes, though narrow, were scuffed from work. Roland's boots, polished to a gleam, seemed unlikely, and Henry's, though slender, bore the wear of a scholar's neglect. Gray's shoes, she recalled, were worn but precise, the kind a man of modest means might keep for appearances. The mark, she thought, was a clue, but its owner remained elusive. Rising, Miss Marple walked the pond's perimeter, her eyes tracing the paths that converged on it. One led to the hall's terrace, where Roland had paced, another to the library, where Henry's window offered a clear view. A third, less trodden, wound toward the attic schoolroom, Gray's supposed refuge. Clara's duties, she knew, kept her indoors, but the pantry was not far from a side door that opened to the garden. Each suspect, she mused, had a path to the water, and the pond, like a silent conspirator, held their secrets. She paused by a cluster of reeds, where a faint glint caught her odious silver hairpin, half buried in the mud. Miss Marple retrieved it with her handkerchief, noting its delicate filigree, the kind a young woman like Eleanor might wear. Yet Clara, she recalled, had mentioned Eleanor's hair being loose that morning, tangled with weeds. A hairpin, she thought, suggested presence before the drowning, perhaps dropped in a moment of distraction or struggle. She tucked it away, her mind returning to the study, where Eleanor's letter to Pritchard had hinted at unease about her affairs. The will, with its forged signature favouring grey, loomed large, but the hairpin added a new thread to the tapestry. As she stood, the sound of footsteps on the gravel drew her attention. Clara Dobbs appeared, her face pale, her apron clean, but her eyes wide with something akin to fear. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling, "I didn't expect to see you here." She clutched a basket of linens, as if it were a shield, and Miss Marple noted the way her gaze darted to the pond, then away. "Just taking the air," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle. "This pondit's a lovely spot, but so lonely. Did Eleanor often come here alone?" Clara nodded, her fingers tightening on the basket. "Most mornings, ma'am." She said it cleared her head, but her voice faltered, and Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her smile remained kind. "You saw her that morning, didn't you?" she asked, her tone as casual as if discussing the roses. Clara's flush deepened, and she shook her head too quickly. "No, ma'am. I was in the pantry, like I said." But her eyes betrayed her, lingering on the reeds where the hairpin had been. Miss Marple filed the reaction away, her mind noting Clara's nervousness, so like Gray's, yet tinged with a different shade of guilt. As Clara hurried back to the hall, Miss Marple lingered, her thoughts circling the suspects. Roland's alibi, confirmed by the blacksmith, held, but his clean boots and debts kept him suspect. Henry's library solitude, verified by the butler, was plausible, but his resentment and the library's view of the pond suggested opportunity. Gray's schoolroom alibi was untestable, his forged will a glaring motive, and his ink-stained fingers a link to the study. Clara's pantry claim, like the others, was solitary, her stained apron and glances toward the study hinting at knowledge or involvement. The hairpin, Miss Marple thought, might belong to Eleanor, but its presence raised questions about the moments before her death. She returned to the bench, sitting for a moment, her shawl drawn against the damp. The pond, she mused, was a stage, its players carefully positioned. Eleanor, trusting and alone, lured to the water, perhaps by a note or a promise. Gray's motive was clearest, but motive alone was not proof. She thought of a St. Mary Mead, drowning where a victim's shawl, caught on a branch, had pointed to a struggle. Here, the absence of such signs suggested a quick, silent act, the work of someone strong enough to overpower Eleanor's slight frame without leaving chaos. The sky darkened, a low rumble of thunder signalling the coming rain. Miss Marple rose, her steps deliberate as she made her way back to the hall. The hairpin, wrapped in her handkerchief, was a clue, but its meaning was unclear. The heel mark, the sketchbook, the forged will. The study's ink smudged with pieces of a pattern, and Miss Marple's mind, like her knitting, was patient, stitching them together with care. She thought of the suspects, each with a path to the pond, each with a secret to guard. In St. Mary Mead, she had unravelled such tangles by watching, listening, waiting for the slip that betrayed the truth as she reached the terrace. The first drops of rain pattered on the flagstones, and Miss Marple's eyes turned once more to the pond, its surface now rippled by the storm. The shadows by the water, she thought, were not just of willows, but of human nature, greed, envy, fear. The truth of Eleanor's death lay there, waiting for her to cast light upon it. Chapter 8. The tutors past the rain that had threatened Marwood Hall all morning arrived in earnest by noon. Its steady patter against the windows a sombre backdrop to the gathering tension within. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing-room, her knitting needles moving with their quiet, relentless rhythm, the soft click-clack a counterpoint to the storm outside. The room was warm, its fireplace casting a flickering glow across the damask curtains. But the air held a chill of suspicion, sharpened by the revelations of Eleanor Ashby's forged will and the elusive truth of her drowning in the ornamental pond. Miss Marple's mind, ever alert, turned now to Lionel Grey, the tutor whose nervous demeanour and ink-stained fingers had drawn her scrutiny from the start. His past, she felt certain, held the key to unravelling the mystery, and she had taken steps to probe it. The previous evening, Miss Marple had penned a discreet note to her nephew, Raymond West, a writer with connections in London who could ferret out information with the tact of a journalist and the curiosity of a novelist. She had asked him to inquire about Grey's background, particularly the vague references from the Northern Academy that Lady Compton had mentioned. Raymond, accustomed to his aunt's knack for uncovering secrets, had promised swift results, and Miss Marple now awaited his reply, her knitting a pretext for the keen observation that never ceased. Grey himself appeared in the drawing-room shortly. After lunch, his wiry frame more stooped than usual, as if the weight of the storm pressed upon him. His spectacles glinted in the firelight, and his fingers, perpetually stained with ink, fidgeted with a loose thread on his cuff. He offered a strained smile to Lady Compton, who was fussing over a tray of sandwiches, and murmured something about retrieving a book from the library. Miss Marple, seated near the window with a view of the sodden garden, noted the way his eyes darted to the study door, a habit she had observed before. It was a telltale sign, she thought, of a man whose thoughts were tethered to Eleanor's papers. "Will the forged will that promised him millions, Mr. Grey," Miss Marple said, her voice as gentle as the rain, "you must find these days trying, with such a loss to bear. Do join us for a moment." Grey hesitated, his smile faltering, but Lady Compton's enthusiastic wave left him little choice. "Yes, do, Mr. Grey," she said, patting the sofa beside her. "You've been so quiet, and we're all in need of company." Grey perched on the edge of the cushion, his hands folded tightly, and Miss Marple noted the faint sheen of perspiration on his brow, despite the room's warmth. She recalled a St. Mary Mead swindler, a man of scholarly airs who had sweated under questioning, his lies unravelling like cheap thread. "I was just saying to Lady Compton," Miss Marple continued, her tone conversational, "how fortunate Eleanor was to have a tutor of such learning. Your academy in the north, where was it, exactly? I've a friend in Yorkshire who might know it." The question was light, almost incidental, but Grey's fingers froze, and his eyes flicked to hers, a flash of panic quickly masked. "Oh, a small place," he said, his voice too casual. "Near Durham, not well known, I'm afraid." He adjusted his spectacles, a nervous tic Miss Marple had come to recognize, and she nodded, her smile serene but her mind alert. Durham, she thought, was a vague enough marker, and Grey's reluctance to elaborate was as telling as a confession. Lady Compton, oblivious to the undercurrent, launched into a reminiscence about Eleanor's studies. her voice filling the room with chatter about poetry and history. Gray nodded at intervals, but Miss Marple noted the way his gaze strayed to the window, where the pond lay hidden in the rain. She thought of the heel mark by the water, narrow and fresh, and the silver hairpin she had found among the reeds. Gray's shoes, she recalled, were worn but precise, and his access to Eleanor's private moments, her lessons, her papers, made him a figure of increasing interest. The forged will, with its precise signature favouring him, was a glaring motive. But Miss Marple knew from St. Mary Mead that motives were only half the story. Proof was the needle that stitched suspicion into truth. As Lady Compton paused to offer Gray a sandwich, a knock at the door announced the butler, Jenkins, bearing a telegram. "For Miss Marple," he said, his tone formal, and Miss Marple accepted it with a murmur of thanks, her heart quickening. She opened it discreetly, her eyes scanning Raymond's concise words. Lionel Gray, alias Leonard Grayson, known swindler. Arrested 1922, Leeds, forging bonds. Released, vanished. Durham Academy, fictitious. Take care, Aunt Jane. Miss Marple's lips pursed, a faint but satisfied gesture. She folded the telegram and tucked it into her reticule, her mind racing with the confirmation of her suspicions. Gray, she thought, was no tutor but a con artist, his scholarly air a mask for greed. The forged will, the ink smudge in the study, his nervous glances, they all aligned, pointing to a man who had seen Eleanor's fortune as his salvation. She glanced at Gray, who was nibbling a sandwich with feigned interest, his eyes still darting to the study door. "Mr. Gray," she said, her voice as mild as ever, "did Eleanor ever discuss her financial affairs with you? A young woman with such a fortune must have had concerns." Gray's sandwich paused halfway to his mouth, and he coughed. A stalling tactic Miss Marple recognized from a St. Mary Mead shopkeeper caught in a lie. "No, never," he said, too quickly. "Our lessons were academic poetry, history. She kept her private matters private." But his voice wavered, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers crumpled the napkin in his lap. A small but telling betrayal. Lady Compton, sensing a shift, leaned forward, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Oh, Jane, you're so clever with questions. But Mr. Gray, you must have known Eleanor was to inherit millions. She was so trusting. Did she ever mention a will?" Gray's face paled, and he rose abruptly, nearly upsetting his teacup. "I really must fetch that book," he said, his voice tight. "Excuse me." He hurried from the room, his footsteps echoing in the corridor, and Miss Marple's eyes followed him, her mind stitching Raymond's telegram into the pattern of the case. "Dear me," Lady Compton said, fanning herself with a lace handkerchief. "He's so jumpy, isn't he? Jane, what do you make of it? That will it's so odd, leaving everything to him. And now this dreadful business with the pond." Her voice trailed off, but Miss Marple only smiled, her expression as placid as the rain outside. "Oddities," she said, "are like loose threads. Pull gently, and the truth unravels." Lady Compton chuckled, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. Piecing together Gray's past with his present actions, she rose, excusing herself with a mention of needing to rest, but her steps led her to the study, where the door stood ajar. Slipping inside, she examined the desk once more, her eyes lingering on the ink smudge, now joined by a faint scratch on the blotter, as if a pen had been pressed too hard. She thought of Gray's ink-stained fingers, his frequent visits to this room, and the letter she had found Delanor's note to Pritchard, expressing concern about her affairs. The forged will, she felt certain, was Grey's work, crafted to secure the fortune he had targeted. But the drowning, she mused, was the critical act, and Grey's wiry strength, his access to Eleanor, and his unverified alibi made him a plausible architect of her death. Leaving the study, Miss Marple paused by a window, the rain now a steady drumbeat against the glass. The pond, barely visible through the downpour, was a silent witness, its secrets locked in its depths. She thought of the heel mark, the hairpin, the pristine sketchbook, each a clue pointing to a staged scene. Grey's past as a swindler, confirmed by Raymond, gave him motive and method, but the act of drowning required nerve, a quality she was not yet certain he possessed. She recalled a St. Mary Mead forger, undone by his own panic when confronted, and wondered if Grey too would crack. Under pressure, as she returned to the drawing room, the storm intensifying outside, Miss Marple's needles resumed their quiet work, a steady rhythm to her thoughts. Lionel Grey was a man of lies, his past a shadow that darkened his every move. The forged will, the study, the pond, they were pieces of his design, but the truth of Eleanor's death required more than suspicion. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had unravelled such men by watching, waiting, and striking at the moment of weakness. Grey's time, she felt, was drawing near, and the shadows of his past would soon betray him. Chapter 9. The trap is set. The rain had softened to a drizzle by the late afternoon, leaving Marwood Hall cloaked in a damp hush that seemed to amplify the undercurrents of suspicion within its walls. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing-room, her knitting needles idle for once, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she surveyed the gathered company. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting wavering shadows across the faces of Roland Vance, Clara Dobbs, Henry Ashby, and Lionel Grey, each summoned under the pretense of discussing Eleanor Ashby's memorial. Lady Compton, ever the eager hostess, bustled about with a tray of tea, oblivious to the tension that coiled like a spring beneath the polite murmurs. Miss Marple, who St. Mary Mead had taught her the art of unravelling secrets with a gentle nudge, had orchestrated this moment with care, her sharp mind poised to spring a trap. The forged will, Lionel Grey's swindler past, and the clues by the pond, the heel mark, the hairpin, the pristine sketchbook, had convinced Miss Marple that Grey was the architect of Eleanor's death. His motive, the promise of millions, was clear, and his opportunity as her trusted tutor was undeniable. Yet proof, she knew, required more than suspicion. It demanded a confession, or at least a slip that would betray him. To that end, she had enlisted Constable Heiress, a stolid but cooperative man, and Mr. Pritchard, the solicitor, to play their parts in a carefully staged confrontation. The drawing-room, with its heavy curtains and watchful portraits, was the perfect stage. Such a sad occasion, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but carrying, as she accepted a cup of tea from Lady Compton, but necessary to honour Eleanor's memory and settle her affairs. Her eyes, bright and unyielding, swept the room, lingering briefly on Grey, whose wiry frame seemed to shrink under her gaze. He sat near the piano, his ink-stained fingers twisting a handkerchief, his spectacles glinting nervously in the firelight. Roland, by the mantel, exuded his usual charm, though Miss Marple noted a flicker of unease in his posture. Clara, perched on a stool, clutched a folded cloth, her eyes darting between the floor and the study door. Henry, slouched in an armchair, lit a cigarette, his indifference a stark contrast to the other's tension. Pritchard, seated at a small table, cleared his throat, his pinched face grave as he opened his briefcase. "Indeed, Miss Marple," he said, his voice measured. "Eleanor's will, as we discussed, raises concerns that must be addressed." He produced the document, its parchment crisp, and laid it before him, the forged signature a silent accusation. Gray's handkerchief stilled, and Miss Marple noted the sudden pallor in his cheeks. "Concerns," Roland said, his tone light but his eyes sharp. "What sort of concerns?" Pritchard glanced at Miss Marple, who nodded almost imperceptibly, her expression serene but her mind alert. "The signature," Pritchard said, "appears irregular. Test sync analysis. Pressure marks suggest it may not be Eleanor's. A forgery, in short." The word hung in the air like a thunderclap, and Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Gray, whose hand twitched, crumpling the handkerchief. Clara gasped softly, her cloth dropping to the floor, while Roland's smile faltered, his fingers tightening on the mantle. Henry exhaled a plume of smoke, his eyes narrowing but his face otherwise unmoved. "Preposterous," Gray cried, his voice high and strained. Eleanor signed it. I was there. His protest was too quick, Miss Marple thought, recalling a St. Mary Mead forger who had crumbled under similar pressure, his denials betraying his guilt. "Were you, Mr. Gray?" Miss Marple said, her tone as gentle as a breeze, but her words precise. "You were often in the study with Eleanor, were you not? A tutor with access to her papers, her trust and, perhaps, her signature." Gray's spectacles slipped, and he fumbled to adjust them, his face a mask of indignation. I was her teacher, nothing more." But his voice cracked, and Miss Marple noted the way his eyes darted to the door, as if seeking escape. She thought of the ink smudge on the study's blotter, the letter to Pritchard expressing Eleanor's unease, and Raymond's telegram confirming Gray's swindler past. The pieces, she felt, were a lining dot. Lady Compton, sensing drama, leaned forward, her eyes wide. "Jane, do you mean Mr. Gray forged it?" "Oh, it's too shocking." Her voice was a mix of horror and delight, but Miss Marple ignored her, her focus on Gray. "There's more," she said, her voice still mild. "A witness, a gardener, in fact, saw a man by the pond that morning, near the time Eleanor drowned. Not a labourer, but someone in finer shoes. It was a lie, a calculated risk, but Miss Marple's St. Mary Mead experience had taught her that a well-placed untruth could jolt the guilty into revelation." Gray's face drained of colour, and he rose, his chair scraping the floor. "That's absurd," he stammered. "I was in the schoolroom, everyone knows it." "Do they?" Miss Marple said, her eyes holding his. "The schoolroom faces away from the pond, and no one saw you there. You could have slipped out, perhaps with a note to lure Eleanor to the water. She trusted you, didn't she? But she found the forged will, threatened to expose you, and you panicked." Her words were soft, almost sorrowful, but they struck like darts. Gray's hands shook, and he clutched the piano for support, his breathing ragged. Roland stepped forward, his charm replaced by wariness. "Miss Marple, that's a grave accusation," he said, but his voice lacked conviction, and Miss Marple noted his relief, as if Gray's guilt absolved him. Clara's eyes filled with tears, her hands twisting the cloth she had retrieved. "It wasn't like that," she whispered, but her voice trembled, and Miss Marple's gaze softened, though her mind remained sharp. Henry, still smoking, watched with detached interest, as if the scene were a play he had no stake in. Constable Heiress, who had entered, quietly and stood by the door, stepped forward, his presence a silent threat. "Mr. Gray," he said, his voice gruff, "if you've anything to say, now's the time." Gray's composure shattered, his spectacles fogging with sweat. "I didn't mean it," he blurted, his voice a raw edge of panic. "She found the will, yes, she was going to tell Pritchard. I begged her to wait, but she wouldn't listen. I followed her to the pond, just to talk, but she slipped, and I—" He stopped, his hands covering his face, and Miss Marple's heart sank, though her expression remained calm. The room was silent, save for Lady Compton's gasp and the crackle of the fire. "You held her under," Miss Marple said, her voice steady. "A quick act, silent, with no struggle. The sketchbook, placed later, was your touch, wasn't it? To make it seem an accident." Gray collapsed into his chair, his sobs muffled. "I panicked," he whispered. "I didn't want to kill her, I couldn't lose everything." Heiress moved to his side, his hand firm on Gray's shoulder. "That's enough," he said. "You'll come with me." As Gray was led away, his head bowed. Miss Marple's eyes followed him, her mind sifting the confession. The heel mark, she thought, would match his shoes, and the hairpin, perhaps dropped by Eleanor in her final moments, would seal the case. The forged will, the ink smudge, the letter to Pritchard, they all pointed to Gray's desperation. His swindlers passed the foundation of his crime. Roland's shoulders relaxed, his charm returning like a mask slipped back on. Clara's tears flowed freely, her relief tinged with sorrow, and Miss Marple noted her glance toward the study, perhaps mourning the secrets she had kept. Henry stubbed out his cigarette, his indifference unshaken, and Miss Marple thought of his library window, its view of the pond, a silent witness he had chosen not to heed. Lady Compton, fanning herself, turned to Miss Marple, her voice awestruck. "Jane, you're a marvel. How did you know?" But Miss Marple only smiled, her expression as placid as the pond after the storm. "People," she said, "are like books. Read closely, and they tell their own stories." As the room emptied, Heiress escorting Gray to the village, Miss Marple remained, her knitting resumed, the needles a quiet rhythm to her thoughts. The trap had sprung, the truth laid bare, but the pond, she knew, would keep its silence, its shadows deeper than any confession. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen such truths emerge from careful watching, and here, at Marwood Hall, the pattern had held. Gray's guilt was clear, but Miss Marple's mind lingered on the others, their secrets now safe, but not forgotten. Chapter 10. The Confession. The evening following Lionel Gray's dramatic unmasking settled over Marwood Hall with a stillness that felt almost reverent, as if the house itself exhaled after days of holding its breath. The rain had ceased, leaving the air cool and sharp, scented with wet earth and the faint tang of the ornamental pond that had claimed Eleanor Ashby's life. Miss Jane Marple sat in the library, a quieter refuge than the drawing-room, her knitting needles moving with their familiar, soothing rhythm. The fire in the grate cast a warm glow across the leather-bound books, but its light could not dispel the lingering shadows of the day's revelations. Gray's confession, wrung from him in a moment of panic, had closed the case in the eyes of Constable Heiress, yet Miss Marple's mind, ever meticulous, sifted through the details, ensuring no thread remained loose. The library was empty save for Lady Compton, who had followed Miss Marple like a moth drawn to her quiet certainty. The older woman sat on a velvet settee, her lace handkerchief crumpled in her hand, her face a mixture of awe and exhaustion. "Jane," she said, her voice hushed, It's like something out of one of your nephew's novels. Mr. Greyer, swindler, a murderer. To think he sat at our table, teaching poor Eleanor, all while plotting." She trailed off, fanning herself, and Miss Marple offered a gentle smile, her needles never faltering. "People," she said, "often wear masks, Lady Compton. Mr. Grey's was well crafted, but no mask holds forever." The confession had unfolded in the drawing room, a scene Miss Marple had orchestrated with the precision of a chess master. Grey's outburst his admission of forging the will, luring Eleanor to the pond, and holding her under in a moment of desperation, had been the culmination of her careful probing. The forged will, with its too perfect signature, had been his scheme to claim Eleanor's millions, a plan rooted in his past as a swindler named Leonard Grayson. Eleanor's discovery of the forgery, her threat to expose him, had driven him to panic, and the pond, with its deceptive calm, had been his stage for murder. The pristine sketchbook, placed to suggest an accident, and the absence of struggle marks had nearly perfected his deception. But Miss Marple's sharp eyes had seen through it. Yet the confession, though damning, left questions, and Miss Marple had spent the hours since piecing together the smaller threads. She had visited Constable Heiress at the village station, where Grey, now subdued, awaited transfer to the county jail. Heiress, a man of few words but growing respect for Miss Marple, had shared Grey's formal statement. A fabricated letter, claiming a lesson by the pond, had lured Eleanor there. In the ensuing argument, she had slipped, and Grey, seizing the moment, had held her under his wiry strength enough to overpower her slight frame. The hairpin Miss Marple had found, he admitted, had fallen during their struggle, a detail he had overlooked in his haste to stage the scene. The heel mark by the pond, Heiress confirmed, matched Grey's shoes, their narrow soles worn but distinct. The ink smudge in the study, the letter to Pritchard expressing Eleanor's unease, and Raymond's telegram exposing Grey's pastel aligned with the confession, forming a pattern as clear as Miss Marple's knitting. Yet she had lingered. At the station, her questions gentle but insistent, ensuring no detail was missed. "He's a broken man now," Heiress had said, shaking his head. "Keeps muttering about the money, how it was his only way out." Miss Marple had nodded, thinking of a St. Mary Mead forger whose greed had led to ruin, his confession as much a release as a defeat. Back in the library, Lady Compton's voice broke her reverie. "But Jane, what of the others? Roland, Clara, Henry, they were all so suspicious, weren't they?" Her eyes gleamed with the residue of gossip, and Miss Marple's smile was faint but kind. "Suspicion," she said, "is like dust it settles on everyone in a troubled house. But let us consider them." She paused, her needles clicking, as she unraveled the roles of the other suspects, ensuring the truth was complete. Roland Vance, with his polished boots and village alibi, had been a figure of charm and potential greed. The blacksmith's testimony confirmed his morning ride, and Miss Marple had verified it through a discreet inquiry with the village postmistress, who had seen him pass. His debts, whispered in village gossip, were real but not desperate, and his modest bequest in the forged will suggested he was not Grey's accomplice. His relief at Grey's arrest, Miss Marple thought, stemmed from fear of scrutiny, not guilt. Roland, she said to Lady Compton, loved Eleanor's hand, not her death. His heart was in his own salvation. Clara Dobbs, with her stained apron and nervous glances, had been a puzzle. The green smudge, Miss Marple had learned, came from cleaning Eleanor's shawl, found near the pond by the gardener and returned to Clara's care. Her devotion to Eleanor was genuine, her tears those of a loyal servant who had suspected Grey's deceit but lacked the courage to speak. Her glances toward the study, Miss Marple realized, were born of worry over Eleanor's papers, which she had seen Grey handle too often. Clara, she said, knew more than she said, but her silence was fear, not complicity. Henry Ashby, cold and detached, had been the least moved by the tragedy. His library alibi, supported by the butler's glance, held, and Miss Marple had confirmed the library's window offered a view of the pond, but no evidence of his involvement. His resentment of Eleanor, rooted in their parents' favoritism, was real, but his inheritance, contingent on no will, had not driven him to act. Henry, she said, lacked the nerve for murder. His bitterness was a spectator's, not a player's. Lady Compton listened, her handkerchief forgotten, her face a study in wonder. "You see everything, Jane," she said. "But how did you know it was Grey, truly?" Miss Marple's needles paused, and she looked toward the window, where the pond lay hidden in the dusk. "Human nature," she said simply. "Greed is a poor actor, and Grey's mask slipped his glances, his lies, his past. The pond told its story. Tooth the hairpin, the heel mark, the sketchbook. They were his mistakes, and I merely read them." She rose, her knitting tucked into her basket, and excused herself, citing a need to prepare for dinner. As she stepped into the corridor, the hall's silence felt lighter, as if Grey's confession had lifted a veil. The pond, she thought, would keep its secrets, but its truth had surfaced, thanks to her patient unraveling. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen such cases resolved by watching, listening, and trusting the patterns of human frailty. Here, at Marwood Hall, the same had held true. Grey's confession was the final stitch, but Miss Marple's mind, ever vigilant, lingered on the others. Their lives now free to resume, their secrets safe, but not unseen. Chapter 11. The threads unravelled the fourth morning at Marwood Hall broke with a tentative clarity, the clouds parting to reveal a pale sun that cast long, delicate shadows across the estate. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp grass, and the faint, lingering musk of the ornamental pond, now a sombre landmark rather than a mystery's heart. Miss Jane Marple sat in the morning room, her knitting needles moving with their quiet, unerring rhythm, the soft click-clack, a steady pulse against the hush of a house slowly reclaiming its routine. The fire of Lionel Grey's confession still smouldered in the minds of the household, but for Miss Marple, whose St. Mary Mead had taught her the value of tying off every loose end, the case required one final reckoning, careful unravelling of the threads to ensure the pattern was complete. Mr. Pritchard, the solicitor, had requested her presence for a private meeting, his pinched face softened by a newfound respect for her acumen. He sat across from her at a small table, his briefcase open, papers neatly arrayed like soldiers at attention. Lady Compton, unable to resist the pull of resolution, hovered nearby, her laced shawl draped over her shoulders, her eyes bright with the afterglow of yesterday's drama. Miss Marple Pritchard began, his voice low but steady. "Your insight has been invaluable. Grey's confession has settled the matter of Eleanor's death, but I thought you might wish to hear the final details of her estate and, perhaps, clarify how you pieced it all together." His tone held a note of deference, and Miss Marple's smile was faint but warm, her needles pausing as she met his gaze. "The estate," she said, "is a simpler matter now, I presume, with the forged will exposed." Pritchard nodded, producing a document not the fraudulent one favouring Grey, but an older will, drafted 2 years prior. "This," he said, "is Eleanor's true will, found among her papers after a thorough search. It divides the trust fund equally between Henry and a children's charity she supported. Roland and Clara received small tokens, sentimental, not substantial. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the document, noting Eleanor's familiar, looping signature, so unlike the forged will's precise mimicry. She thought of a St. Mary Mead widow whose genuine will, hidden in a Bible, had thwarted a greedy nephew. A fitting legacy, she murmured, for a young woman of heart. Pritchard leaned forward, his curiosity evident. But Miss Marple, how did you know it was grey? The will, the pond, the confession, it's all so intricate. Lady Compton, unable to contain herself, chimed in, "Yes, Jane, do tell. You were like a detective, seeing things none of us did." Miss Marple's smile deepened, her expression as serene as the sunlit garden beyond the window. "It's merely observation," she said, "and a touch of understanding about human nature. Let me explain as simply as I can." She set her knitting aside, her hands folding neatly in her lap, and began, her voice soft but clear. "Lionel, grey was the pivot, but I considered all the players Roland, Clara, Henry, and Grey himself. Each had a motive, or seemed to, and each had opportunity, or so it appeared. But the pond, you see, told its own story." She paused, her eyes drifting to the window, where the pond glimmered like a distant mirror. The absence of struggle. Marks, the pristine sketchbook, the hairpin, they suggested a deliberate act, not an accident. And the forged will, with its precise signature, pointed to someone with access to Eleanor's papers and a reason to act. Roland Vance, she continued, was charming but debt-ridden, a man who might court a fortune, his alibi riding. In the village, seen by the blacksmith held firm, and his boots, so clean despite the muddy paths, suggested he was nowhere near the pond. His relief at Grey's arrest was that of a man spared scrutiny, not a murderer unmasked. His motive was love, or perhaps ambition, but not murder. Clara Dobbs, Miss Marple went on, was devoted, her tears genuine, but her stained apron and glances toward the study raised questions. The green smudge, I learned, came from cleaning Eleanor's shawl, found near the pondermaid's duty, not a crime. Her nervousness stemmed from suspicion of Grey, whom she saw lingering in the study too often. She knew of the forged will, or feared it, but her loyalty to Eleanor kept her silent. Clara's heart was with her mistress, not with malice. "Henry Ashby," she said, her tone thoughtful, was cold, his resentment of Eleanor palpable. His library alibi, backed by the butler's glance, was plausible, and the window's view of the pond gave him opportunity. But Henry, I saw, lacked the fire for murder. His bitterness was passive, a scholar's envy, not a killer's resolve. The true will, favouring him equally, removed his motive, for he gained nothing by Eleanor's death that he would not have had in time. "And so to Grey," Miss Marple said, her voice taking on a quiet intensity. "His past, uncovered by my nephew, revealed a swindler, a man skilled in forgery. The will, with its unnatural bequest to him, was his creation, its ink matching. The smudge in the study. His alibi to schoolroom was untestable, his nervous glances a betrayal of guilt. The heel mark by the pond matched his shoes, the hairpin a trace of Eleanor's final struggle. When she found the forged will and threatened to expose him, Grey panicked. He lured her to the pond with a false note, and in that moment of fear, he drowned her, staging the scene with the sketchbook to suggest an accident." Pritchard nodded, his face a study in admiration. Remarkable, he said. The letter to me, expressing her uneasit, was the final clue, wasn't it? Miss Marple inclined her head. It showed Eleanor's suspicion, her intent to act. Grey could not risk her speaking, and the pond was his desperate solution. Lady Compton, fanning herself, gasped. Jane, you saw it, all the pond, the will, his lies. But how did you make him confess? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained placid. A small deception, she said. The gardener, as witness, was a fiction, but guilt, you see, is a fragile thing. Press it, and it cracks. Grey's fear did the rest. She thought of a St. Mary Mead thief, undone by a false claim of a hidden witness. His confession spilling like water from a broken jug. Human nature, she knew, was her greatest ally. Pritchard gathered his papers, his task complete. The estate will be settled according to the true will, he said. Henry inherits half, the charity the rest. Roland and Clara will receive their tokens, and Grey, well, he faces justice. He rose, bowing slightly to Miss Marple. Your clarity saved us from a grave miscarriage, Miss Marple. I am in your debt. Lady Compton clapped her hands, her voice bright. Oh, Jane, you're a marvel. Marwood Hall won't forget this. Miss Marple rose, her knitting basket in hand, and excused herself, citing a need to pack for her return. To St. Mary Mead, as she stepped into the corridor, the hall's silence felt lighter, its secrets laid bare. The pond, she thought, had been the stage, its calm a lie that hid Grey's crime. The hairpin, the heel mark, the ink smudge, the letter, they were her signposts, guiding her to the truth. Roland, Clara, and Henry, freed from suspicion, would carry their own burdens, fear, envy, but none had crossed the line into murder. She paused by a window, the pond visible in the morning light, its surface rippling gently. The truth, she murmured, is like water. It finds its level, no matter how deep it's buried. In St. Mary Mead, she had unravelled such mysteries by trusting the patterns of human frailty, and here, at Marwood Hall, the same had held. The threads were tied, the pattern complete, and Miss Marple's quiet satisfaction was as steady as her knitting, a work well done. Chapter 12. The quiet return, the final morning at Marwood Hall unfolded under a sky of soft blue, the sun's gentle warmth drying the last traces of the storm that had shadowed Eleanor Ashby's tragedy. Miss Jane Marple stood in the guest room. Her modest suitcase, packed with the precision of a woman accustomed to tidy endings. Her knitting basket, ever her companion, rested by the door, its contents neatly arranged wool, needles, and the small notebook where she jotted observations. Too delicate for casual eyes. The hall was quiet, its rhythm restored, though the memory of Lionel Grey's confession and the truth of the ornamental pond lingered like a faint echo in its corridors. Miss Marple, whose St. Mary Mead had honed her knack for seeing beyond the surface, felt a quiet satisfaction, tempered by the sombre weight of a life lost. She descended the grand staircase, her steps light but deliberate, her shawl draped over her shoulders against the morning chill. The drawing room, where so much had unfolded, was empty now, its fire cold, its portraits gazing down with silent approval. Lady Compton awaited her in the hall, her stout figure swathed in a velvet cloak, her face a blend of gratitude and reluctance. To see her guest depart. "Jane, you can't leave so soon," she protested, clasping Miss Marple's hands. "You've saved us from a dreadful tangle grey in chains, the will sorted, and poor Eleanor's memory honoured. Stay another day." "Do." Miss Marple's smile was warm, her eyes twinkling with the gentle firmness of one who knew her place was elsewhere. "You're too kind, Lady Compton," she said, her voice soft as the sunlight streaming through the windows. "But St. Mary Mead calls, and my roses need tending. Besides, Marwood Hall has its peace now." Lady Compton sighed, her handkerchief fluttering, but she nodded, sensing the resolve beneath Miss Marple's modesty. "You're a marvel, Jane," she said. "I'll write to Dolly Bantry and tell her how you outwitted a murderer." The mention of Dolly, Miss Marple's friend in St. Mary Mead, brought a flicker of amusement. She thought of their teas by the vicarage, where village gossip wove tales as intricate as any at Marwood Hall. "Do give Dolly my love," she said, "and tell her the truth is often simpler than it seems." Lady Compton promised, her eyes misty, and escorted Miss Marple to the waiting car, a modest affair arranged by the butler, Jenkins, whose newfound respect for her was evident in his deferential bow. As the car pulled away, Miss Marple glanced back at the hall, its grey stones softened by the morning light. The pond, visible in the distance, shimmered like a polished coin, its secrets no longer hidden. She thought of Eleanor, trusting and vibrant, undone by Grey's greed, and of the clues that had led her to the truth, the forged will's precise signature, the ink smudge in the study, the heel mark by the water, the silver hairpin, the pristine sketchbook. Each had been a thread, and Miss Marple's patient hands had woven them into a pattern that exposed a swindler's crime. She recalled a St. Mary Mead jeweller, whose theft was betrayed by a single misplaced gem, and smiled faintly. Human nature, she mused, was ever the same. Whether in a village or a grand estate, the drive to the station was brief, the countryside unfolding in a patchwork of fields and hedgerows. Miss Marple's mind, though at ease, lingered on the others. Clara, Henry, whose lives had brushed against the tragedy. Roland's charm, she suspected, would soon find another heiress, his debts a spur to ambition rather than crime. Clara's devotion, freed from fear, would serve the hall faithfully, her silence a lesson in courage she might yet learn. Henry's coldness, untouched by the drama, would keep him in his library, his envy a private wound that time might dull. None, she felt certain, had crossed into Grey's darkness, though each had carried shadows of their own dot. At the station, she boarded the train to St. Mary Mead, settling into a corner seat with her knitting. The rhythm of the wheels matched the click-clack of her needles, and as the landscape blurred past, she thought of the pond, its deceptive calm a mirror for the human heart. Secrets, she murmured to herself, are like ripples. They spread, but they always return to their source. In St. Mary Mead, she had unravelled such ripples: a baker's theft, a widow's deceit, a curate's lies, each a small drama that honed her skill for the larger stage of Marwood Hall. Back in her cottage, she would sit with Dolly Bantry over tea, the village gossip a gentle counterpoint to the weight of murder. She would recount the case, perhaps, but only in broad strokes, for Miss Marple knew the power of discretion. The hairpin, the heel mark, the forged will, they would remain in her notebook, a private record of a puzzle solved. The pond, she thought, was like St. Mary Mead's own stream, its surface hiding depths that only patience could plumb. As the train neared her stop, Miss Marple tucked her knitting away, her suitcase at her feet. The quiet return was her reward, the peace of a village where secrets, though ever present, were hers to uncover. Marwood Hall was behind her, its tragedy a chapter closed, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes and steady hands were already ready for the next, wherever it might lie.